The chamber of unblinking constellations was a cathedral of dread, carved into the asteroid heart of the Kyler Imperium's defense nexus, a space where light was an engineered concept and silence the most sacred form of debate. Its walls did not merely reflect the galaxy. They were the galaxy, embedded with crystalline matrices that pulsed with the real-time terror of countless star systems. High Elder Vesh, his ancient, multifaceted eyes dimmed by an exhaustion that transcended the physical, rested his skeletal forearms on the council dais, the polished obsidian cool beneath his aged scales. He listened to the cacophony of fear that was not spoken, but radiated through the chamber's telepathic resonance fields, a terror cultivated by a species they had habitually, philosophically, and politically mocked for centuries. Below him, the assembled Grand Council, the architects, the generals, the diplomats of 1,000 years of Kyler unchallenged supremacy, were a tableau of frozen, bewildered impotence. The central display, a holographic projection of the Sol Kyler contact zone, was a horrifying splash of red and absence, detailing the systematic, bloodless, and polite dismemberment of the Kyler Fifth Observation Fleet. The mockery, it seemed, had been answered. Counselor Zill, a being of considerable political gravity whose entire career was built upon the doctrine of Kyler exceptionalism, finally broke the enforced stillness, his voice a low, grating rumble that carried the weight of institutional disbelief. "It is not the scale of the destruction that unnerves me, Elder Vesh. We have weathered wars of attrition against the Zidonian swarms. We have outmaneuvered the Rylaxian technocracy. It is the method. The reports are contradictory to the very foundation of our historical analysis. We categorize the Sol species as volatile, primitive, limited by their hyper-individualistic biological imperative. Their communication was saturated with raw, unfiltered emotion. Their history, a monotonous cycle of self-inflicted conflict and irrational artistic expression. They were the punchline of the Galactic theater, the short-lived, carbon-based anomaly whose primary societal metric was the pursuit of subjective happiness. Yet the Fifth Fleet was not annihilated by a barbaric frenzy. It was deactivated. Not a single Kyler vessel was fired upon after their initial, unsanctioned, aggressive maneuver. Their entire armada, a massive formation of destroyers and siege platforms, simply ceased functioning. The human vessels then held their position, silent, cold, and utterly professional. Where is the panicked retreat? Where is the disorganized, furious counterstrike we predicted? Where is the cowardice we had so confidently ascribed to their psychological profile? High Elder Vesh slowly lifted his head, the movement itself an effort of will that suggested deep internal erosion. "Counselor Zill, you speak of an anticipated display of cowardice, but the true question before this chamber is not the nature of the Sol species' courage, but the absolute catastrophic failure of our own. Our mockery was not merely an act of cultural arrogance. It was a profound, strategic blindness, an unpardonable hubris that has now jeopardized the entire Imperium. We lost our courage, Zill. We lost the courage to reevaluate. We found comfort in the caricature, in the predictable, self-soothing narrative of their inferiority. We feared the truth of their quiet evolution more than we feared a hypothetical threat from a known enemy. The Fifth Fleet was a display of calculated, methodical warfare executed with an ethical precision that defies all known interspecies conflict matrices. The Sol species, the hairless apes of Sol III, have executed an act of war with the detached, surgical logic of a master technician pruning a diseased growth. Their actions suggest an entirely different level of philosophical maturity than the one we so gleefully documented in their historical broadcasts. The very silence of their victorious fleet is an accusation. It is a philosophical challenge we cannot answer with plasma fire. Ambassador Krell, a specialist in xenolinguistics and cultural modeling who had been relegated to the diplomatic fringes for years due to his persistent, unsettling warnings, finally rose, his form vibrating with controlled desperation. He projected a new, terrifying data stream onto the constellations, a Kyler tactical schematic overlaying a human defensive perimeter around a minor, resource-poor moon in the disputed zone. The human lines were not drawn according to conventional defensive geometry. They were fluid, multi-layered, and adapted instantaneously to every simulated Kyler countermeasure. "Elder Vesh speaks the truth," Krell stated, his voice stripped of all diplomatic cadence. "I spent my cycles studying their pre-contact historical narratives, their primitive philosophical texts, their cultural myths of self-sacrifice and defiance against impossible odds. We read their stories and saw only irrationality. We saw Achilles' fatal flaw and Heracles' brute strength. We saw a species obsessed with the struggle, the internal, painful conflict. We mistook this fascination with struggle for an inherent inability to master themselves. We thought they were perpetually at war with themselves and thus fundamentally crippled. We ignored the underlying message, that a species that embraces its own internal chaos, that confronts its own existential dread on a daily, individual basis, is capable of an adaptive resilience that no single-minded, collective consciousness can ever match. They know fear intimately. They have integrated it. And when a species has done that, their subsequent actions in the face of external threat are not driven by panic, but by a cold, reasoned, and utterly terrifying dedication to survival. The schematic then collapsed, showing a potential human counteroffensive trajectory, a path through the supposedly impenetrable asteroid-choked Kyler defensive lattice that had been deemed mathematically impossible. The entire chamber recoiled in a silent, collective gasp. The arrogance of centuries had just evaporated in a burst of cold, predictive geometry. The debate descended into an intense, protracted dissection of the single remaining human transmission received following the neutralization of the Fifth Fleet. It was not a demand for surrender, nor an ultimatum for negotiation. It was a single, cryptic phrase, repeated on all Kyler diplomatic channels, encoded in a multi-layered linguistic cipher that contained elements of Kyler ancient poetry, mathematical formalism, and even a selection from a highly regarded yet obscure Saul philosophical text on ethical governance. The phrase was, "The burden of proof is lifted. The dialogue now begins." The meaning was debated for 3 full planetary rotations. Some argued it was a veiled threat, a boast of their newly demonstrated power. Others saw it as a calculated psychological tactic designed to induce paralysis. High Elder Vesh saw deeper, his ancient mind grasping at a concept alien to the Kyler doctrine of power consolidation. "It is a statement of responsibility," he declared, the sheer weight of the concept silencing the bickering council. "They are saying that they were forced to demonstrate their power against their own ethical framework in order to earn the right to a dialogue we had denied them through our prejudice. They did not want to be feared. They wanted to be heard. And we, in our self-congratulatory isolation, could only hear them through the language of war. The burden of proof was their need to show they were not the fragile, fleeting insects we categorized them as. And now that they have, they will expect us to engage with them on a level that assumes parity, a parity they have bloodlessly forced upon us." The political fallout was immediate, fracturing the Kyler Imperium's traditional power blocks. The military command clamored for immediate, overwhelming retaliation, a demonstration of the Imperium's true might to restore the narrative of supremacy. The diplomatic guild, however, paralyzed by the sheer, cold logic of the human response, argued for a protracted period of strategic silence, a time for the deconstruction of the human mind before making another fatal move. Vesh, sensing the tectonic shift in galactic power dynamics, overruled them all. "No more silence. Silence is what permitted the mockery. Silence is the sanctuary of the comfortable lie. We will offer them a dialogue, but we will do so on our own terms to mask the profound fear that now grips this chamber." The Kyler initiated the Echelon Protocol, a highly specific, complex, and resource-intensive diplomatic gambit reserved for situations of species-level existential threat. A protocol designed by ancient galactic powers to prevent catastrophic, self-inflicted annihilation. It was a humiliating concession, a direct admission that the Saul species, the subject of countless Kyler satirical holoplays, was now recognized as a peer or potentially a superior. The designated meeting point was the neutral, derelict orbital station known as the Lament of Xylos, a centuries-abandoned research outpost in the borderlands. A deliberate choice by the Kyler to project an image of stoic antiquity and indifference to superficial opulence. The Kyler delegation, led by the shattered Counselor Zill and the prescient Ambassador Krell, arrived in a flagship of immense, terrifying grandeur, a vessel bristling with hidden weaponry and shielded by layers of gravitational distortion fields. The human response vessel was a small, unassuming, almost aesthetically bland shuttle, its hull devoid of the aggressive angles and imposing scale that defined every known starfaring race. It docked with a practiced, utterly routine precision that suggested this was not a meeting of H tension, but a mere logistical transfer of data. Representative Alistair Vance, the designated human envoy, emerged onto the cold, rusted docking bay ramp alone. He was tall, unremarkable in physique, dressed in a simple, unadorned uniform of deep gray, lacking any visible rank insignia or decorative flair. His demeanor was one of profound, almost unsettling calm, an absence of the nervous energy or political posture that characterized every Kyler dignitary. He did not rush, nor did he hesitate. He merely walked, his steps measured, echoing in the vast, empty space. Zill and Krell, flanked by a silent honor guard whose internal psych monitors registered near-uncontrollable anxiety, met him in the center of the bay. "Representative Vance," Counselor Zill intoned, his voice an effort to maintain his habitual basso authority. "You stand on a sovereign demarcation point. The actions of your vessels against the Kyler Fifth Fleet constitute a clear, unprovoked act of aggression. The utilization of the Echelon Protocol is a measure of our forbearance, not a concession of guilt. We require an immediate, full-spectrum accounting of your technological capability and strategic doctrine." Vance stopped 6 paces from Zill. He did not offer a ritual salute, nor did he display any of the expected expressions of subservience or aggressive defiance. His eyes, the color of a faint, cold blue sun, focused on Zill with an intensity that felt less like scrutiny and more like an effortless, complete understanding. He spoke in flawless, synthesized Kyler, the pronunciation perfect, the accent devoid of any detectable human inflection. "Counselor Zill. The Echelon Protocol is an admission of systemic failure on both sides to avoid conflict. It demands transparency, not tactical advantage. I will address your request for an accounting, but only after we address the fundamental philosophical discrepancy that permitted this unfortunate incident to occur. You inquire about our strategic doctrine. Our doctrine is defined by a single, unwavering ethical maxim: non-interference through perceived incapability." Zill's complex facial scales shifted in confusion and intellectual disgust. "That is not a doctrine. That is a state of cultural decay. Are you suggesting you intentionally cultivated an image of weakness?" Vance inclined his head slightly, a subtle gesture that carried the weight of a complex argument. For 3 centuries, Kyler cultural data streams, absorbed globally, depicted humanity as a chaotic, fragile, and ultimately inconsequential species. We observed this mockery. We monitored the galactic laughter. We saw the Kyler political and military establishment cement its perception of us as little more than a biological nuisance. We did not challenge this perception because the alternative, an immediate, forceful demonstration of our true capacity, would have precipitated a full-scale galactic war of preemptive elimination. Every sophisticated, technological species, Kyler included, views a newly emergent, powerful neighbor with deep suspicion. To be dismissed as harmless is to be granted the greatest strategic asset of all: time. Time for philosophical integration, time for technological refinement, and time for the quiet, internal resolution of our own ancient, internal conflicts. We calculated that the cost of your arrogance was less than the cost of your fear. We allowed you to mock us, Counselor, because the alternative was the certain death of billions across the galaxy through preemptive panic. Ambassador Krell, who had remained silent, took a hesitant step forward, his internal dread momentarily eclipsed by a spark of profound, almost religious recognition. The mockery was a shield, a cultural camouflage designed to suppress your threat profile. The sheer philosophical and ethical discipline required to maintain such an illusion over centuries. It defies the Kyler understanding of ambition. "Ambition is the engine of entropy, Ambassador," Vance replied, turning his gaze towards Krell, his tone shifting subtly to acknowledge the depth of the ambassador's insight. "Our ambition is not territorial acquisition, but stability. The Kyler Fifth Fleet initiated an unauthorized incursion into a sovereign zone following months of escalating, aggressive posturing. Their intent, regardless of official policy, was to trigger a localized conflict that would confirm your established narrative of our instability. Our response was the Echelon Protocol, the military phase of the Echelon Protocol, which mandates the absolute non-lethal neutralization of the aggressor. We did not destroy their ships. We simply accessed their master control systems, isolated their firing solutions, disabled their propulsion, and transferred all crew life support functions to an emergency reserve, leaving their operational systems intact but inert. We provided an overwhelming demonstration of capacity without taking a single life. That is our Trachic doctrine, to achieve absolute victory without inflicting permanent loss. That is the true burden of proof. Zill stumbled backward a half step, the sheer scale of the admission. the ability to remotely and flawlessly commandeer a vast Kyler armada, crushing the final vestiges of his institutional pride. You demonstrated the capacity to end the Kyler Imperium with a single synchronized command. We demonstrated the capacity to prevent you from ending us, Vance corrected, his voice a level, unwavering monotone. And now that your established strategic narrative has collapsed, we can proceed to the actual dialogue that the Echelon Protocol requires. We are not here to demand reparations. We are here to offer a unified front. The subsequent exchange, which lasted for 48 uninterrupted hours, was less a negotiation and more a profound, shattering education for the Kyler delegation. Vance proceeded to reveal aspects of human culture and technology that redefined their place in the galaxy. He spoke of the axiomatic drive, a theoretical propulsion system the Kyler had dismissed as mathematically impossible, yet which the humans had quietly perfected, allowing instantaneous, non-localized translation across vast interstellar distances, a technology that rendered the Kyler fleet's logistical framework obsolete. He then introduced the concept of cognitive synchronization, the ability to pool individual human intellects into a non-hierarchical, adaptive network, a system that allowed for instantaneous, complex decision-making, explaining the baffling speed of their fleet's tactical response. But the most devastating revelation was philosophical. Vance projected onto the derelict station's wall a detailed, perfectly accurate simulation of the Kyler High Council chamber, showing the very political machinations, the internal divisions, and the individual psychological profiles of every key elder and counselor. We understand your politics, Counselor Zill, because your empire is built upon the same fundamental philosophical flaws that drove our own conflicts millennia ago. We did not just read your history, we modeled it. We did not just translate your language, we absorbed your cultural neurosis. We are not a species of chaos, we are a species that has mastered the management of chaos. Your arrogance was our greatest resource, and now that it has been exhausted, we can no longer afford to maintain the illusion of fragility. We have come to a point in galactic history where our collective self-interest must supersede our individual species pride. Vance then executed the large-scale reveal, not with a display of weaponry, but of restorative capacity. He projected a real-time feed from the distant, war-torn planet of Krill V, a world decimated by a conflict between two minor, non-aligned species, a world the Kyler had dismissed as a lost cause. Suddenly, immense, non-Kyler vessels materialized in orbit around Krill V. They were not deploying destructive weaponry. They were deploying massive, atmospheric reintegration devices and localized seismic stabilizers. Within a single hour of the demonstration, the atmospheric toxicity levels on Krill V dropped by 2 orders of magnitude, and the planet's broken magnetic field began to mend. This is a human terraforming and stabilization fleet, Vance explained, his voice calm amidst the monumental spectacle. We do not use this technology to conquer, we use it to heal. We perfected it not for galactic dominance, but for the fundamental ethical imperative of life's preservation. If we can restore a dying world in hours, imagine what we can do to a thriving one. We present this not as a threat, but as the context for our dialogue. We could have used this capacity to render your homeworld's defenses inert, but to do so would violate the Echelon Protocol, which is sacred to those species who have achieved true ethical self-mastery. The impact on Zill was profound. He was a Kyler noble, a lineage defined by war and calculated expansion, but he was also a being capable of cold, logical assessment. The human reveal was a masterstroke of psychological warfare precisely because it lacked all the hallmarks of aggression. The Kyler had lost their empire not to a stronger military, but to a superior ethical and intellectual framework that rendered their entire strategic doctrine obsolete. The shame of the centuries of mockery was now a leaden weight of existential self-doubt. Zill did not demand surrender, he demanded the truth. Why, Zill whispered, the sound raw and unfamiliar. Why the elaborate deception? Why risk war at all when you possessed such a profound, non-lethal supremacy? The cost in galactic stability was immense. Vance stood perfectly still, the blue light of the Krill V restoration reflecting in his eyes. The human species learned a crucial lesson from our own history. A fragmented civilization, no matter how powerful its component parts, is inherently unstable and vulnerable to a single unifying threat. The galaxy is fragmented. The Kyler dominate through fear and technological advantage. The Zidonian swarms through numbers. the Relaxian technocracy through isolation. No power has the moral authority to force unity. We knew that a threat from us would only cause a reactive, panicked coalition against humanity. What was required was a catalyst, a localized, painful conflict that would force the dominant powers to question their fundamental assumptions, to shatter their internal narratives of supremacy, and to realize that the threat of a common enemy must supersede the comfort of the internal rivalry. We needed the Kyler Imperium to lose its courage in the old, destructive ways, so that it might find its courage in a new, necessary way. Your initial aggression was the unfortunate, yet necessary activation trigger for this shift. High Elder Vesh, once the symbol of Kyler immutable power, sat in the cold silence of the council chamber, the holographic constellations dimmed to a respectful twilight. Counselor Zill and Ambassador Krell stood before him, their reports delivered, the raw, unedited transcripts of the human dialogue laid bare. The atmosphere was no longer one of fear or anger, but of a desolate, profound sorrow, the grief of an empire realizing its own obsolete nature. They used our arrogance as their shield and our pride as their weapon, Vesh stated, his voice barely a rasp. They fought a war of philosophy, not of plasma, and we lost, catastrophically. He looked to Krell, the only one who had ever seen the truth. Ambassador Krell, you spoke of their mastery of internal chaos. Their mastery, I now see, is the mastery of the greater good. They are not conquerors, they are cosmic pragmatists. The question is no longer how we fight them, but how we ally with them. What was the human condition for the cessation of hostilities? Krell stepped forward, his head bowed. The human envoy, Representative Vance, made a single non-negotiable request. Not reparations, not territory, not political concessions. They requested a Joint Strategic Synthesis Initiative, JSSI. They asked for the immediate, unfettered access to all Kyler ancient cosmological data, all deep space sensor logs extending back to the Imperium's foundation, and all cultural myths relating to the void beyond the edge. In return, they offer the immediate, unconditional restoration of all Kyler vessels held under the Echelon Protocol, and the full, open sharing of their axiomatic drive and cognitive synchronization technology, to be managed by a joint human-Kyler administrative body. Vesh closed his eyes, the ancient Kyler symbol for a burden accepted. The terms were not a demand for subservience, but a request for partnership framed as a necessary exchange of knowledge. The humans were offering to equip their former mockers with the tools of their own supremacy in exchange for data, old, obscure mythological data. The exchange is unequal in their favor, Vesh concluded, but the alternative is eternal irrelevance. Accept their terms. Begin the synthesis initiative. And assign Counselor Zill, whose blindness initiated this catastrophe, to oversee the complete deconstruction of the Kyler narrative of supremacy. He must be the first to unlearn the lie. The alliance was ratified in a ceremony devoid of celebration, an act of political necessity and philosophical capitulation. The Joint Strategic Synthesis Initiative was launched with unprecedented speed, merging Kyler millennia of astronomical observation with human technological capacity for data analysis. Representative Vance remained on the Kyler Central World, operating from a nondescript research facility, communicating with the efficiency of a silent machine, driving the collaboration forward with unrelenting focus. The galaxy watched, bewildered, as the Kyler, the dominant power, appeared to be dismantling their own defense systems and integrating the technology of the species they had so recently warred with. The mockery turned to political bewilderment, and then a slow, dawning fear among the other galactic powers who had enjoyed the spectacle of the Kyler humiliation. 6 galactic standard rotations into the JSSI, the true depth of the human agenda began to surface, not through diplomacy, but through the terrifying clarity of the data. Ambassador Krell and Representative Vance were deep within the Kyler Prime Archive, a vast, geologically shielded repository of imperial knowledge. They were examining the myth of the Great Silence, an obscure Kyler legend that spoke of a periodic celestial event where the stars seemed to wince and pull back from a single, unmoving point in the void. A story dismissed by Kyler science as a primitive psychological projection of cosmic loneliness. Vance stood before a holographic projection of the Kyler star chart, overlaid with human-derived gravitational models. He pointed to the location of the mythical Silence, a cold, sparse sector of the void beyond the established galactic boundary. The Kyler data, fused with our advanced gravitational tensors, confirms the myth is not an artistic expression, Ambassador Krell. It is a terrifyingly accurate historical account. This region exhibits a non-baryonic gravitational distortion that defies all known models of celestial mechanics. It is a signature that appears only in the deep space logs of advanced, dying civilizations. A dark matter anomaly, Krell suggested, his voice tight. A structured anomaly, Vance corrected, his blue eyes distant, staring into the holographic void. Our deep space listening arrays, the true focus of our pre-contact efforts, have been tracing a structured, non-random signal emanating from outside the galaxy for the last 80 of your cycles. The signal is not broadcast by radio waves or light. It is a complex mathematical lattice encoded into the very structure of the spatial curvature. It is a deliberate, ancient warning. And the source is the distortion signature in the Great Silence. Vance then displayed the core data of the signal. It was a simulation, rendered in universal mathematical constants, depicting the cyclical death of advanced civilizations. It showed star systems being consumed, not by supernovas or black holes, but by a form of pan-dimensional organism, a predatory species that moved not through space, but across the boundaries of reality. They were referred to in the signal's core dataset by a single, terrifying signifier, the Xylos. Krell's ancient mind seized on the name, connecting it to the Lament of Xylos, the derelict station where they had first met. The Lament, it was not named for a fallen city, it was a warning. The Xylos are a nomadic interdimensional predator, Vance stated, the magnitude of the reveal finally washing over the Kyler ambassador. They do not seek resources or territory, they seek life, specifically the energetic output of fear, chaos, and societal collapse. They are drawn to the thermodynamic signature of a civilization that has turned upon itself. They harvest the chaos, and they are migrating towards this galaxy. The distortion in the Kyler void is their vanguard. The silence is the point where they are testing the fabric of our reality. The revelation was not merely one of an external threat. It was the chilling, terrifying explanation for human behavior. You knew, Krell breathed, a tremor running through his ancient scales. All of it. The mockery, the self-imposed isolation, the sudden ethical perfection of your arsenal, it was all preparation for this. Vance confirmed the truth with a simple, crushing gravity. We detected the first structured signal decades ago. Our analysis concluded that no single galactic power, fragmented by internal rivalries and suffocated by historical arrogance, could possibly mount a successful defense. A united, ideologically cohesive front, utilizing the combined technological knowledge of the entire galaxy, was the only mathematical path to survival. The Kyler Imperium was the largest, the most technologically entrenched, and the most arrogant power. You were the keystone that needed to be strategically shattered and then reformed. The war was never about Kyler-human conflict, Ambassador. The war was the painful, accelerated forging of the Galactic Unity Protocol. We needed you to lose your self-comfort, to lose your destructive courage, to see a species you deemed inferior exhibit an ethical and technological superiority you could not deny. We needed the shame and the panic of the defeat to force the synthesis initiative. Our entire strategy, from the moment we achieved interstellar capacity, was a controlled experiment in forced galactic cohesion. Krell stared at the depiction of the Xylos in the simulation, amorphous, terrifying beings that fed on the psychological residue of self-destruction. The cosmic horror was profound, but the realization of human ethical depth was equally staggering. They had endured centuries of mockery, they had risked an internal war, and they had perfected a doctrine of non-lethal, absolute superiority, all for the benefit of a galaxy that held them in contempt. Their ultimate strength was not their axiomatic drive, but their willingness to be the villain, the catalyst, the universally misunderstood actor for the ultimate preservation of all life. The burden of proof is lifted. The dialogue now begins, Krell quoted the human transmission, the cryptic phrase now stripped bare of all ambiguity. They were not demanding a seat at the table. They were announcing the beginning of the end of the internal conflicts forced by their own capacity. Vance nodded. The dialogue is not with the Kyler ambassador. The dialogue is with the Xylos, and our only language for them is unity. The subsequent assembly of the Grand Council was no longer a chamber of dread, but a crucible of absolute unifying terror. High Elder Vesh, informed of the Xylos' threat, did not collapse into despair. He found the new courage, the courage of cosmic responsibility. He ordered the immediate full-spectrum broadcast of the Xylos' data to every starfaring race in the known galaxy, a message not of Kyler dominance, but of shared, existential vulnerability, validated and confirmed by the once mocked Sol species. The Kyler, the former masters of the galaxy, now became the chief evangelists for human-led unity. The final image presented to the galaxy was not of the Xylos, but of a colossal, newly formed fleet. It was a testament to the success of the Human-Kyler Synthesis Initiative, now rapidly incorporating assets from the Relaxian technocracy and the Zidonian swarm. The human vessels, utilizing the axiomatic drive, formed the hyperfast, non-localized core. The Kyler Armada, now retrofitted and synchronized, provided the immense conventional projection of force. It was a fleet of countless ships, unified under a single joint command structure, their attention focused, not on the internal boundaries of the galaxy, but on the silent, cold void of the Great Silence. High Elder Vesh stood on the command deck of the Kyler flagship, watching the combined fleets mobilize for the long, terrifying journey to the galactic edge. Representative Vance stood beside him, his expression one of calm, professional readiness. "We mocked you for your fragility, your emotionality, your short lives," Vesh stated, his voice a low, gravelly acknowledgement of profound respect. "We mistook your capacity for self-destruction for an inability to master the greater challenges. We were fools." Humanity learned a long time ago that true strength is not the ability to withstand a blow, but the willingness to accept the necessary shame and isolation required to prepare for a threat only you can see, Vance responded, his gaze fixed on the hyperfast translation flashes of the coalescing armada. "We sacrificed our reputation for your survival, Elder Vesh. That is the highest form of our particular terrifying courage. The old war is over. The true war, the one we prepared for, begins now. The arrogance of the past must be replaced by the quiet, unified resolve of a species that knows how to manage its own chaos in the face of absolute threat." The final philosophical reflection of the Kyler High Elder, transmitted across the silent, unified command network to the countless species now relying on the ingenuity of the fragile Sol species, was a single, profound thought. We lost our courage when we believed our own propaganda. We have found it again in the humility of facing a shared, cosmic truth, delivered to us by the quiet, ethical architects of our own salvation. The species we mocked for centuries has just saved our entire civilization by showing us the terrifying depth of their calm, logical, and absolute dedication to the preservation of life itself. The colossal, unified fleet, a host of destroyers, siege platforms, and nimble, hyperfast human corvettes, engaged their axiomatic drives simultaneously, vanishing from the known galactic plane, headed for the Great Silence and the edge of reality. The galaxy waited, now unified in a silence far more profound than the one preceding the war. The silence of profound, absolute fear and the absolute, unwavering trust in the quiet competence of the beings they had so tragically underestimated. The vastness of the Kyler chamber of unblinking constellations was now lit by a single, focused light, the light of the impossible, terrifying future, one that required the strength of the short-lived, chaos-taming human species to survive.